Presiding Officer, in many ways our prosecution service works in ways similar to those that have worked for centuries, but society and the crimes committed by some in it have changed. I'm currently studying in my spare time the life of John McFeet, who was found guilty of housebreaking and the theft of a coat and a bottle of whisky on the night of the 22nd to 23rd August 1830. The court papers show that this 17-year-old young man had left home after falling out with his father, a chair maker at 36 Leith Walk, after he'd refused to give him money for clothes. McFeet stayed in lodgings with some other young people for about a week. The precognitions, 17 of them, show a young man obviously at a loose end and perhaps egged on by his peers. He broke into his father's neighbour's house to obtain drink and stole a coat opportunistically. He and his friends appear to have been larking about on Calton Hill and then retired to their lodgings to consume the whisky. His trial on the 11th of November 1830 saw 41 jurors summoned. His guilt was quickly determined, perhaps more rapidly than justice today might demand, and he was transported to New South Wales for 7 years. He never returned to Scotland. So that's one Scottish crime we've dealt with. The story, of course, could represent similar activities by similarly bored young people today, and the response, involving police, fiscal, prosecutor, court, witnesses, and the method of prosecution has changed surprisingly little. But today there is scrutiny of a different order, and properly so. The focus is more on reform of the criminal, not merely on punishment, and supporting all affected by the crime. So for the Crown Office and the Fiscal Service, there are complexities that were not present in the 1830s. And the arrangements for the accused of access to legal advice are also much wider. As far as I can see, Mr McFeet had no such advice. So how are we doing? Number of crimes have fallen to the lowest level in 40 years, and our prosecutors make a substantial contribution to that, alongside police, societal change, prisons, and many others. And at a time of change, the staff in the system feel under pressure. Cases are becoming more complex, there is closer attention to process, to deliver efficiency, inevitably removing what might be thought of as slack time. Such changes are not always welcome. But let me just address the subject of change. Oliver Mundell argued at some length against change. Let me point him at what is now known as the Hawthorne effect. Over an extended period of time, changes were made in one part of a Western electric factory in Cicero, Illinois, in the 1920s and 30s. The other part of the factory remained unchanged. After every single change that was made, productivity rose and absenteeism dropped. At the end of the trials, the factory was returned to its previous state while the researchers considered their findings, and productivity rose again. It was concluded that the process of change, rather than the nature of the change itself, was the source of benefit to the employee and the company. It's now also described as the observer effect and derives simply from people being taken an interest in. Well-managed change is good. The convener referred to court delays. Unhelpfully, perhaps, she failed to develop all the sources of these, in particular that defence counsel can also come to the court unable to proceed. Like the prosecution, the difficulties can lie with reluctant witnesses. Some parts of the system are startlingly efficient. As a member of a previous Justice Committee, I visited Glasgow Sheriff Court on a Monday. We saw an astonishing 50+ cases moved on in the course of an hour. Efficient? Very. Effective? Rather less, obviously. There seemed to be no novice offenders, and engaging the whole panoply of the Sheriff Court seemed overkill. So the reform of which we heard during this inquiry was, among other things, focused on making better use of time, and I welcome that. That in turn should create more space for preparation by all involved. I welcome, of course, in particular, a planned reduction in the use of temporary staff. Professor Fred P. Brooks posed the question in his book, The Mythical Man Month, how do you make a late project later? The answer is add staff. And the reason is that when new staff arise, there is a cost to the existing staff to integrate them into the team. provide them with knowledge of the local operation and methods, and push them forward to be fully productive members of the team. It's not simply external training. The existing team members carry that burden. So a reduction in staff churn takes two burdens off the system: less wasted time on integration, and a larger proportion of the time staff spend in the service becomes productive. A further benefit that can be derived can come from staff seeing a task through to its completion. Time taken picking up and putting down items of work is wasted time. Convener is correct when she points to frustration in delivering improved computer support across the public sector. The London Ambulance Service failure under the Tories in the early 1990s, the SQA computer failures under the Labour and Liberal Democrat administration in the 2000s, and we've had our failures on these benches too. But the private sector can and do find it difficult to make computer changes too. Douglas Ross raised court closures as a source of difficulty, and yet, after the closures, the system appears to be more efficient, higher throughputs without a corresponding increase in resource being required to achieve them. While we heard from some deputies that they felt constrained by the existence of a central unit for marking, others pointed out it was not a new process and they did not feel constrained. My apologies, I've moved to another point. Mr Ross.
Douglas Ross.
Thank you, and I welcome the member allowing me to intervene. He said Douglas Ross said X, Y and Z about court closures. Will you accept that I was quoting evidence from the bar associations who were highlighting the impact they are seeing in courts around the north east of Scotland, in the Central Belt, that they believe that court closures is having a direct impact on the service we are providing in Scotland?
Stewart Stevenson.
That's probably a useful clarification, and I accept what the member says. However, we did have balancing views as well. Moving on to talking about the central unit, I want to just highlight Rear Admiral Grace Hopper of the US Navy. She retired at the age of 80 as the oldest ever regular member of the Navy. She said, act first, apologise later. And she meant, assume you have the power and accept that you'll be held to account as to how you use it, until you're told that you don't. Mr Ross also rightly spoke of witnesses' frustrations about delays. For my part, I welcome the programme of reform, one of whose outcome must be to serve the interests of all those who contribute to the delivery of justice. I served as a juror in the early 1980s in a two-day trial in Linlithgow Sheriff Court of two accused, each facing 7 charges. A relatively simple case compared to child abuse, domestic abuse, financial crime. I genuinely wonder how we can help juries make decisions that they will feel more comfortable about in more complex cases. We, of course, took new evidence from jurors because what goes on behind the jury room door is secret. But for the solemn cases, the most serious, they're an important part of the system. In 1830, George Sutherland, painter, glazier, John MacDonald, an innkeeper, John Ashley, a chemist, were jurors in John McFeet's trial, and a similar diversity prevails today. We saw that support for witnesses today far exceeds that given even 20 years ago, because without witnesses there can really be no trial. And where once victims could be invisible, we now have support for them. The inquiry has been of value in throwing light on a vital part of our criminal justice system and enabling us in the Justice Committee to hold all responsible for making the system work to account in future. And for my part, I suspect too for others, my understanding has been extended and my preparation for my committee role enhanced. Thanks from my part, as others have said, to all who are involved in delivering justice in Scotland. While the optimist in me hopes for an end to the need for any criminal justice system, the realist in me knows that we shall continue to depend on it to time immemorial. Liam MacArthur made a plea for sentences no sentences to be under a year. In 1830, no sentences were over a year. If you were guilty of something worthy of incarceration over a year, you were either taken out and hung or you were sent to Australia. I welcome this report. I hope it's a useful contribution to debate. Presiding Officer.